Hello, this is the Reverend Dr. David Chotka of Spirit Equipped Ministries. Don't despair. I wish that I had been the first to find this story. It makes me laugh every single time I remember it. I heard it over the radio when I was driving in a car in the north part of Edmonton when I was in a blue funk. I was in a terrifically foul mood. I was pretty low. And as soon as I turned the radio on, Dr. Chuck Swindoll was preaching over the radio as he did in those days. And it immediately cheered me up when I heard the end of the story. To this very day, whenever I find myself in a low spot, I remember the story, and even now it makes me chuckle. The year was 1910. It was right after the great missionary conference in Edinburgh, Scotland, that had changed the face of missions across the earth. It sent all kinds of missionaries across the planet. And a young American woman from the United States West Coast sensed the call of God to share the gospel in the interior of Africa. Her entire family were believers, every last one of them. They were prayerful, and her church was surprised at first to hear that she wanted to do this, but when they knew what had happened, they all decided to get behind her 100%. They did little fundraisers to help her raise the money that she needed to be able to get herself to that place. They did all kinds of prayer meetings. They had special meetings in the church to get behind her and bless her and establish her. And eventually, she got in a train and took a very long train ride across one side of the United States all the way over to New York City, where she was booked in to stay at a missions house until she could get onto a boat that would take her across the Atlantic Ocean to the west coast of Africa. Well, of course, it was a major undertaking in that culture. She arrived just a few days before the departure, and she was staying in that mission house in an upper story room with a large slider window that was overlooking the street. Of course, as she traveled and as she was staying in the missions house, she began to realize just what it was that she was beginning to do. She would likely never see her family again. She most certainly wouldn't see many of the friends that she had grown up with. And she was going into a culture that she was only beginning to understand. She didn't know any of this. And as she was in the mission house waiting for that ship to take her across the Atlantic, a couple of packages arrived on the same day, 2 or 3 days before she was to go. She opened up the packages. She found a whole bunch of handwritten letters from the people in her church family who were committing to pray for her, wanting her to send them a return address so that they could send care packages to her. They were assuring her of their prayers, etc., and it was a beautiful gift of kindness. Now, there was a separate envelope that had arrived at the same time as the package. There was a very special gift inside, a lovely handcrafted card with a note from every member of her family and her extended family. And inside that envelope was a $10 bill. Her friends, her family, her church, they had all scraped and saved and scrounged to be able to send her that gift of money. Remember, the year was 1910. 5 cents would buy you a meal out, so do the math and you can see how big the gift was. It was more than a month's wages. It might even have been 2 months' wages for the average worker. Of course, the cards, the letters, the sacrificial gift of money, the pledge of prayers, the pledge of ongoing support, well, it moved this lady to the very depths of her soul. With the envelope in hand, she went over to the window and pressed her head against the cool glass as she began to weep with thanksgiving. She closed her eyes as hot tears of gratitude came out of the corners of those eyes, and she thanked the Lord for all the wonderful people who were supporting her. Then she opened her eyes. She looked out onto the street, and there was a scruffy, unshaven, shabbily dressed man leaning against a light standard. His hair was disheveled. He was looking more than down and out. He was obviously extremely depressed. Well, the missionary lady saw him and felt compassion for him. And she immediately did what missionaries have done throughout the generations. She started to pray for the man. And as she did, an idea came into her head, an impulsive idea, a major idea. She didn't even know if she should do this, but she took an envelope. She put the $10 bill inside the envelope, sealed it up, and then she wrote 2 words in block letters on the front of the letter. The 2 words were, "Don't despair," in very large caps. Then she opened the old-fashioned slider window on the 2nd story. She called to the man on the street, who then looked up. They locked eyes. He nodded. She waved the letter. Then she dropped the envelope. He picked it up, read the 2 words, kind of scratched his head, opened the letter, and saw $10. inside this envelope in 1910. Then, of course, an enormous grin crossed his face. She giggled and laughed and waved and said, "I'll be praying for you." How would you have reacted? Well, the man burst out laughing. He waved back, and it was a month's wages falling out of the sky. The man went skipping away, obviously overjoyed. Now press pause. After the missionary lady did that, she wondered at her sanity. That was an enormous gift of sacrifice from her friends and family and church back on the other side of the United States, and she'd given it away to a total stranger. But then she realized that she was surrounded by love and prayer and purpose. The man had nothing. With that done, she decided that she was committing that to the Lord. She went about her day and made final arrangements, packing, making sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed to get her final sea voyage in order so that she could travel to Africa. Well, the very next day, very, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, there was a banging on the front door of the mission house where the lady was staying. The couple didn't want to answer, but the banging, it was 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. The banging continued, and soon 4 or 5 or 6 people from the mission house were all awake on the first floor of the place, and eventually they answered the door, and there was a clean-shaven man with a fresh shirt, pressed clothing, combed hair. He looked immaculate. He had an enormous, silly grin on his face, and he insisted on seeing the lady on the second story who was in the room with the slider window. Well, eventually they woke her up, and in her dressing gown, she was descending down the banister stairway trying to figure out what was happening. He was on the front landing, surrounded by 5 or 6 from the mission house. Well, she looked over at him, and it took her a moment, but eventually she recognized that it was the same guy who had been on the street the day before. Well, she was 5 or 6 steps up from the bottom, and he reached out with a manila envelope and said, "Here's your $50. His eyes were sparkling with delight. He handed her the manila envelope, and lo and behold, $50 were in there, and she said, "$50? Well, I gave you $10, and I told you don't despair." "Yes, you did," he said, "and you were totally and completely right. Don't despair came in 5 to 1. He bet it on the horses, and he won. And actually, he'd made his own little wager, and he'd received some money back too, and so he bought himself a new shirt. He got himself some new clothes. He got himself cleaned up and decided to repay the lady who had given him the tip on don't despair in the race. To say God works in mysterious ways would be an understatement. It's so easy to be misunderstood. That lady didn't even believe in things like that. When I heard Swindell tell the story, despite my utterly foul and lousy mood, I burst out laughing. And whenever I'm tempted to despair, I remember that crazy outworking of events. It reminds me of all the times that God supplied, and He has done through all the years. Almost always, God's supply came when I was doing something generous, not when I was trying to grab things, when I was giving rather than taking, or serving rather than being served. And in these crazy COVID days of being stuck in the house, most of us depressed with being housebound and unable to work, or just plain old-fashioned lonely because we can't just get up and go and see people. It's worse if we're ill. Body isn't working as it should. In those days like that, our temptation is to despair. Now, I don't want to put a Band-Aid on something very, very dangerous, but somehow I've learned this principle. If you can find a way to be generous, if you can find a way to give to another, as you do, despair loosens its grip on your soul. Giving turns something wonderful into motion. God has so ordained the universe that when we practice generosity, generosity rebounds to come back at us. Now, that missionary lady understood what Jesus meant when our Lord said this: "Sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." She understood that. She left everything, and then she gave what she had away to somebody who she didn't even know. She was astonished to discover the power of what she had done release something else that Jesus our Lord had said. In fact, the return likely made her laugh all those years that she served in Africa. Here is what Jesus said about giving and receiving. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Pressed down, shaken together, running over. They'll pour into your bosom. This is the Reverend Dr. David Chotka of Spirit Equipped Ministries. If you'd like to receive bi-weekly blogs, you can go to the www.spiritequipped.com page. You can see the blogs written there, or you can go down to the bottom of the page and you can opt in and put your email information there, and we'll send out these blogs to you twice a week. Or you can go right down below that and click on the YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to YouTube videos, and you'll be able to see these videos whenever you want to do that. I do hope and pray that your day is going beautifully. May the Lord bless you.